e-learning for trainees, that is TED Talks. So I welcome our beloved Purnima ma'am. I welcome our friendly Sai, ever smiling, and to this first PG presentation, case presentation. And I have my PG who is a brave doctor and his name is Dr. Yogesh, to take up the challenge as the first candidate. And I think if we will have more candidates, more PGs coming up to take up this training, and it will be a good exercise before they face their external in both DNB and MD exams. Ma'am, few words.
Yeah, I think it's a very good initiative by the Anesthetist Society, and this is a start, and we hope that it will be of benefit to the PGs, and we can take it forward. So this first one is an experiment, so let's see how it goes, and how many people join, and how many people attend this session. So let's proceed.
Thank you, ma'am.
Let's hope for the best.
So Yogesh, you can start presenting your case.
Yes, sir. So we have a patient, Mr. Murugan, who is 50 years old, and he is a daily wages by occupation, and he hails from Gindi. Comes with the presenting complaints of abdominal distension for the past 6 months and jaundice for the past 1 month. On elaboration of the presenting complaints, his abdominal distension, the patient was apparently normal 6 months ago, and then he developed abdominal distension, which is insidious in onset and uniformly progressive in nature. And it is associated with swelling of the both legs, and he gives history of difficulty breathing. He gives history of loss of appetite, history of constipation, and history of facial puffiness. And on elaborating of jaundice, the patient developed jaundice for the past 1 month. There is no history of fever, vomiting, or body pain. There is no history of itching, high-colored urine, or clay-colored stools. And he gives no history of chest pain or palpitations. He gives no history of reduced urine output in the past. He gives no history of blood vomiting or black-colored stools. There is no history of painkiller abuse. In the past history, he is a known case of type 2 diabetes mellitus for the past 6 years. He is currently on oral anti-hypoglycemic drugs, tablet metformin 500 mg TDS and tablet glimepiride 1 mg BD. And he gives history of taking native medicine for allergic skin condition and stopped. He gives no history of surgery in the past, no history of tattoo or promiscuous behavior in the past, no history of blood transfusion, no history of systemic hypertension, coronary artery disease, cerebrovascular disease, TB, bronchial asthma, CKD, anything suggestive of such diseases. In personal history, he's been married for the past 25 years and lives with his wife. He takes mixed diet and he gives normal bladder habits, reduced appetite for the past 6 months. He gives history of constipation. There is increased daytime sleepiness, and he takes alcohol for the past 20 years. He takes whiskey 180 to 350 ml per day. And he gives history of cigarette smoking for the past 20 years. And he gives history of 5 cigarettes per day. And no similar history in the family, no allergic history. So, shall I move to the examination, sir?
So on basis of, ma'am, anything, ma'am?
Yeah, that's okay. What did the patient come to the hospital for? What you didn't say what the was it for the abdominal swelling or per se, or did he come for something else with some other complaint?
He came for the abdominal distension, ma'am.
Abdominal distension.
Distension, difficulty, jaundice.
And jaundice. Right. Okay. So let's proceed for the examination. And what was your initial impression about this patient?
From the history collected, it points towards abdominal pathology, more towards liver. So after general examination, I would like to examine abdomen for the systemic examination.
Great, good.
So what is your, Yogesh, what is your points favoring liver as primary pathology?
The history of abdominal distension for the past 6 months, slowly progressing and insidious in onset, and the history of jaundice in the past 1 month, and he gives history of alcohol intake for the past 20 years every day, 180 ml of whiskey, and he gives history of native treatment taken for a skin condition which could lead to hepatic dysfunction, and he gives history of altered sleep habits, constipation, and altered bowel habits. So it points towards more towards liver and abdomen.
Altered bowel habits, do you think they are very significant in a patient with liver disease? By itself, not necessarily. But something else in the history which could also contribute to liver disease, which you have already mentioned? Diabetes mellitus.
Yes, ma'am. Diabetes mellitus. He's a known case.
He's a known case of diabetes. So diabetes could be a cause for liver disease as well, right? So he has multifactorial. He has many factors could give rise to liver failure or liver dysfunction per se. Let's see.
Yes, ma'am.
Sai, anything?
Yeah, ma'am, we'll go to examination then.
Okay.
On general examination, the patient is moderately built and nourished. He is conscious, oriented to time, place, and person. And icterus is present. Pallor could not be ruled out due to the presence of icterus. And there is bilateral pitting pedal edema in the both legs. And no clubbing is present. No clubbing, cyanosis, and no generalized lymphadenopathy could be elucidated. And signs of liver failure, he has alopexia, and there is presence of gynecomastia. There is presence of spider nevi on the chest, and abdominal distension is present. Palmar erythema is present, and parotid swelling is present. Parotid fullness is noted during the general examination. On pulse, his pulse rate is 80 per minute, regular, normal volume, normal character, felt in all peripheral pulses. There is no radiofemoral or radioradial delay. His BP is 100/70, recorded in the left upper limb in supine position. His respiratory rate is 18 per minute, regular, and his temperature is 36.7 degrees Celsius.
That's it. General physical examination, something you have missed. Clubbing.
He said negative.
He said clubbing? You mentioned clubbing? Oh.
No clubbing.
No clubbing. Okay. I think I missed it. Yeah. Okay.
Systemic examination. On moving on to abdomen examination. On inspection, the abdomen looks uniformly distended and both flanks are filled. Umbilicus looks to be in the midline and diverted. Not moving with respiration. There is no visible pulsations. There is no visible peristalsis. And skin over the abdomen looks stretched and shiny. External genitalia appears to be normal. On palpation, abdomen girth is around 140 centimeters, and abdomen is warm with mild tenderness with palpation. On deep palpation, the right upper quadrant, a tender swelling is palpable 5 centimeter below the right costal margin, extending from the right mid-axillary region to the mid-axillary line to 5 centimeter below the mid-clavicular line. And surface is smooth and firm in consistency, and the margins are rounded. And non-tender, smooth, palpable swelling is palpated 5 centimeter below the left costal margin in the mid-clavicular line. Firm in consistency, notch is not able to palpate the notch, and which moves with respiration, and it's not bimanually palpable. Upper border is not felt. And fluid thrill is present. There is no significant inguinal or supraclavicular nodes. There is no external genitalia. There is no edema. There is no hernia. On percussion, liver and splenic dullness are percussed. On auscultation, bowel sounds is heard. There is no bruit or venous hum heard anywhere in the abdomen. Examination of other systems, CVS, S1, S2 is heard, and there is no added murmurs. In respiratory system, normal vesicular breath sounds heard equally on both sides and all areas. There is no added sounds. In CNS, there is no focal neurocortical deficit. From the history and clinical examination, the provisional diagnosis is a case of 50-year-old male with type 2 diabetes mellitus with features of chronic decompensated liver disease with portal hypertension and ascites.
What are the clinical signs of portal hypertension on examination?
On exam, the clinical signs are ascites, um, hepatic encephalopathy can be noted clinically, and any history of bleeding.
We'll divide it into history and examination. Then, in history, you said?
In history, we can ask for any bleeding features, GI tract bleeding features, any hemorrhoid features, or any melena, and history of and any history of previous hospitalizations due to bleeding or any infections due to hospitalizations, any loss of renal function. And in clinical examination, there is presence of ascites, and if there is severe portal hypertension, caput medusae can be seen. And
was it there in your patient? Any caput, any prominent veins?
no, ma'am, no, I couldn't find any prominent veins.
Okay.
That wall of the abdomen.
And one more input.
Spider nevi and
Spider
other?
nevi.
Okay.
And one more thing in general examination, you have to always mention JVP, presence of jugular venous pressure, because you have to rule out any cardiac related or volume overloaded patients. So mention JVP in your general examination. Okay? So
Yes, sir.
that is one thing. So on the basis of history and examination, you have arrived at a conclusion of liver as a primary pathology. Isn't
Yes,
it?
sir.
So
Let's. Shall we go to investigations to confirm your diagnosis?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. What are the investigations you'll do in this patient?
We'll start from a complete hemogram with hemoglobin and hematocrit. Most of the patient with cirrhosis will have
Just a second, sir. We'll start with blood. We'll organize it to blood investigations and radiological. Okay. Then we start with blood. Then
we start with the complete hemogram with hemoglobin and hematocrit and total and differential leukocyte counts to assess any presence of infection and platelet count to find out the presence of thrombocytopenia. Then we'll do the coagulation profile, prothrombin time and INR, and partial thromboplastin time has to be recorded. To find
telling the significance of each. So start with hemoglobin because to assess for intraoperative needs, perioperative needs. Also, preoperative hematocrit of less than 30% is a independent factor of poor prognosis. Okay. Then TLC and DLC will tell us presence of infection, which is common in these patients, especially subacute bacterial peritonitis. Okay. Then we go to platelet count for thrombocytopenia because we also found splenomegaly. There could be platelet trapping. Then we went to coagulation profile. PT is raised because
coagulation almost all coagulation factors are produced in liver except the factor 3, factor 4, and 8. So prothrombin is the factor 7 is the factor which is having the least plasma time. That is 4 hours is the T half of the factor 7. So it is the earliest to get elevated. So it produces it informs us the synthetic functions of the liver, and prothrombin time is the most significant predictor of liver function.
Okay, there is increase in PT because of a vitamin K deficiency. Okay, and fat soluble vitamin K is malabsorbed, and vitamin K is needed for synthesis of factor 7, 9, and 10, which determine the prothrombin level. Because of these, there is reduced prothrombin, and so there is increase in PT. Okay, then go to APTT. Significant APTT.
In APTT could be increased in the because of the deficiency of clotting factors. APTT could be increased in these patients, and
now when APTT is increased, it shows you the poor prognosis. Okay, that is the significance because this shows reduction. This shows active liver disease. Okay. Next, then LFTs. Other investigation. We finished hemogram and coagulation profile. Others?
We have to do a baseline renal function test. There is urea, creatinine, and electrolytes, and random blood sugar. So in most of these patients, there will be associated renal dysfunction. It could be due to hepatorenal syndrome or any other renal pathology. So the baseline creatinine value has to be noted. It will help us in MELD score also. And most of these patients will be having electrolyte abnormalities because most of these patients will be on diuresis. They'll be on spironolactone for the ascites. So we need to know the baseline electrolyte value, and if there is presence of hypokalemia, that will worsen the hepatic encephalopathy. And we need to know the bicarbonate level as well, because these patients will have a metabolic acidosis picture. And
most probably, what is the most common electrolyte imbalance which you see?
Hyponatremia could be seen, along with there could be plus or minus hypokalemia can be seen.
See, patient if he's on loop diuretic like furosemide, they may be hypokalemia. If they have spironolactone in their treatment, then they will have hyperkalemia. So hyponatremia is the most common.
Hyponatremia is a very important prognostic indicator in these patients. So it definitely makes the prognosis worse, implies a severity of liver disease. What about liver function test?
Yes, ma'am. We need to do a liver function test. So
I think before you say kidney function test, you should have said liver function test.
You should prioritize, like CBC, you come to liver function, then you go to synthetic functions like PT, PTT, then go for RFT. So depending on the case, you can arrange your investigations.
Investigation should always be by priority. What is most important?
okay, ma'am.
Yeah, go ahead.
Regarding liver function, the patient's ALT and AST can be measured, and
Bilirubin, serum bilirubin.
Yeah, first bilirubin, then come
Total, indirect, direct. Okay.
serum bilirubin direct. So to rule out whether there is any obstructive pathology or synthetic or cirrhotic pathology, and to rule out whether there is any hepatocellular injury, we need to serum enzymes AST and ALT has to be.
Just a second. So indirect bilirubin, if it is more than 200 micromole per liter, it is again an indicator of poor prognosis. This means there is synthetic conjugation of the bilirubin and liver is also affected. That is advanced disease. Okay. Then enzymes.
And enzymes, ALT and AST can be measured. If the ALT and AST concentration is ratio more than 4, it points towards Wilson's disease. If it's 2 to 4, it points towards alcoholic liver disease. If it's less than 1, it points towards obstructive disease. Then GGT and transnucleodase all points towards cholestatic liver disease. And
5' nucleotides. And GGT is specific for one subset of liver disease, that is
biliary
alcoholic.
So on the basis of history, Yogesh, you said he had jaundice and you suspect what could be the cause of this liver disease. You have alcohol as a base, means as a cause, and you said there is a history of drug intake, isn't it? So he
is a diabetic.
And diabetic. These are 3 points which is pointing. And we had
I'd be surprised how many diabetics land up with liver failure. So non-alcoholic liver disease is a very big problem in our country now, and because of diabetes. Yes, Surinder, carry on.
So on the basis of history, can you tell how can we divide, or what will be the cutoff time for to say that this patient is an acute liver failure patient, this patient is a fulminant hepatic failure, or this patient chronic liver disease? Do you have any timeline?
To be an acute liver failure, it can be divided into hyperacute, subacute, and acute. So some acute and subacute. So hyperacute, it will be less than 7 days. The dysfunction will develop within 7 days. Then acute would be 7 to 28 days, and subacute would be more than 28 days. And hyperacute, it's mostly caused by toxins like paracetamol poisoning, idiosyncratic drug reaction. Then
rat poisoning is also one common cause.
yes, sir. Rat poisoning, mushroom poisoning, then acute hepatitis, then in pregnancy, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, then Rett syndrome. All these will be causing acute liver dysfunction, and fulminant hepatic failure will have a better prognosis compared to that of subacute and acute hepatic failure. And the prominent feature about acute liver failure is hepatic encephalopathy and cerebral edema.
So how do you stage? Means what are the factors precipitating hepatic encephalopathy? You mentioned it, so I'm asking.
What he means is that in a patient with chronic liver disease, what will precipitate? What are the things that will cause hepatic encephalopathy or will precipitate encephalopathy? Isn't it? Yes, Surit?
Yes,
not in an acute phase.
Not
in a chronic liver disease.
Yeah.
Drugs such as sedatives and antidepressant drugs could precipitate hepatic encephalopathy. Then bleeding into gastrointestinal tract. Then infection, sepsis. Then portal hypertension, portosystemic shunting. Then constipation. Then increased protein overload, protein intake, protein load by the patient. Then so the basic pathology here is increase in toxins that will be normally metabolized by the liver. That is ammonia, mercaptans, phenols, manganese, short chain fatty acids. All these will be normally metabolized by the liver and then enter the systemic circulation. But here, because of the portal systemic shunt, these metabolites will be entering into the portal systemic circulation, and they will cross the blood-brain barrier and produce inhibitory response on the brain by acting on the GABA receptor. And there will be disruption of the blood-brain barrier in acute liver failure. So there will be they can easily cross the blood-brain barrier and produce suppression.
So in examination, what is one clinical sign you look for?
The asterisk is, and the patient will be given a series of set of dots. That is 25 to 30 dots will be given. He needs to connect the dots within. A normal patient can connect the dots within 15 to 30 seconds. But hepatic encephalopathy patient will be disoriented and will take longer time to connect the dots and may not be able to do the connection. Or the patient will be asked to draw a simple diagrams like a star or round or box. The patient will not be able to do that. So these are all the early features of hepatic encephalopathy. And
hepatic encephalopathy is one of the factors included in the child book's prognostication. Okay, so it becomes very important.
Stages of hepatic encephalopathy?
Hepatic encephalopathy, there are 4 stages. In stage 1, there is poor mentation, slowness of slurring of speech, and there will be poor thinking. In stage 2, there is the patient is lethargic and drowsy, but easily arousable to voice or pain. But there will be occasional hyperactive behaviors. In stage 3, the patient will be drowsy and lethargic, but he will not be not easily arousable by voice, but can be arousable by pain. In stage 4, the patient will be unconscious and may or may not respond to pain.
It's subjective, isn't it? It's mostly subjective. What you may feel as 3, I may feel it as 2.
4.
1 and 4 are really classical, but 2 and 3 may vary between you and me. Okay, so that is 1.
In fact, stage 1 is very difficult to recognize sometimes. Most of the time it's only the family or somebody very close to the patient who can make out those subtle changes in behavior. So it's important to take the history from the attendants to know if there has been some behavioral change or something which may be very, very subtle.
Yes.
One more thing, Yogesh, since you have commented on portosystemic connection, we'll finish portosystemic connection. So what are the common sites of portosystemic shunts which you have in our body?
Around 5 anatomical regions in which portosystemic shunting occurs. One is the lower esophageal region, that is the connection between left gastric and ascigas vein. This is the most common region for the variceal bleeding, and this also contributes to the gastric portosystemic shunting. Then the second common is the one causing hemorrhage, that is in the lower rectum between superior and inferior, middle and inferior rectal veins. Superior contribute to the systemic and middle and inferior to the superior to the portal and inferior to the middle, inferior middle to the systemic circulation. Then around the umbilicus between the prehepatic and superficial and inferior epigastric veins, and in the Barr area of the liver between the IVC and hepatic veins to the portal system in the Barr area, and between the retroperitoneal area between and renal vessels will connect into the
So these are common
posterior
sites.
abdominal organ. Posterior abdominal.
Okay, these are common sites. So this is regarding the hepatic encephalopathy and things like that. So,
Just one question. Why does bleeding, how does bleeding cause hepatic encephalopathy? How does it precipitate?
There is bleeding into the gut. There will be associated hemolysis will occur, and there will be massive protein intake. There will be the heme and bilirubin will be taken up, and this will finally lead into increased amino acid load. So
Ammonia load.
ammonia load.
So there is a massive amount of blood in the gut, and there is action by the gut bacteria. There is a role of the gut bacteria on the production of ammonia in these patients, and hence which gets absorbed and which can. That's why there is a role of lactulose in these patients as a treatment. So what does lactulose do?
It is a disaccharide which doesn't get absorbed into the systemic circulation. So it basically increases the bulk of the stool and it clears the gut. So along with lactulose, we can also give rifaximin or neomycin. These are antibiotics which will not get absorbed, and they will basically reduce the bacterial load in the gut, so that reducing the ammonia production from the bacteria.
And the other important, very important reason why bleeding may precipitate encephalopathy is because of hypotension. So hypotension leading to a reduction in liver blood flow in patients who are, on the brink can also precipitate hepatic encephalopathy. So hypotension due to any cause, whether it is because of bleeding, of course, that will definitely cause hypovolemia and hypotension, but even sepsis or anything else which can cause hypotension can reduce the hepatic blood flow, and thereby the liver function will be further deteriorate further and may precipitate hepatic encephalopathy. Okay.
So you are continuing with LFT, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So on the basis of LFT, so what are the 3 types of jaundice you can differentiate with using LFT?
Prehepatic, hepatic, and posthepatic. So in prehepatic, mostly it will be due to hemolysis, or there will be increased load to the liver due to peripheral hematoma or clot. So in this, unconjugated bilirubin will be increased than that of conjugated. In hepatic, we will be finding increase in bilirubin, both direct and indirect will be increased, along with increase in the enzymes. Enzymes will be also increased. In post-hepatic, there will be more conjugated bilirubin, and there will be associated with high colored urine and clay colored post-hepatic, that is due to obstructive jaundice. And post-hepatic will also be associated with increase in GGP and 5-nucleotidase, because those enzymes are mainly present in the biliary system. So it will also become increased, and ALP may also get increased in the post-hepatic jaundice, that is obstructive jaundice.
Anything, Sai?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about hepatopulmonary syndrome. We finished hepatic encephalopathy. We finished hepatorenal. Tell me about hepatopulmonary syndrome. How will you make it out in history? There's one particular term.
In history, if the patient has hepatopulmonary syndrome, the patient will give a history of difficulty breathing during standing. That is, orthodeoxia will be given by the patient. That is due to the presence of intrapulmonary vascular dilatation, and it will be present in the base of the lungs. And when the patient stands, these vascular dilatation will get accumulated, and there will be a VQ mismatch due to this intrapulmonary vasodilatation, and the patient will feel breathless. Once the patient lies down or lies in the sit, the patient will be able to breathe better. So this will be
what bedside investigation can be done to detect these shunts?
The presence of intrapulmonary vascular dilatation can be detected by echocardiogram along with agitated saline injection. So we need to have a central line for that, along with transthoracic echocardiogram. So agitated saline has to be injected through the central line. Normally, these air bubbles will be trapped in the lungs in a normal patient in the capillary bed. But in a patient who has intrapulmonary vascular dilatation, these air bubbles pass through the capillaries and will enter into the left heart. So it will take 3 to 5 cardiac cycles for the air bubbles to reach the left heart. So if the air bubbles reach the left heart, we can identify the presence of intrapulmonary vascular dilatation.
Yeah, very good.
How will you decide which patient needs to be checked for hepatopulmonary syndrome?
Actually, criteria for hepatopulmonary syndrome, it occurs.
Pulse oximetry in your physical examination, because now it's almost a part of general physical examination. So pulse oximetry gives you a very good indication of which patient you may need to investigate for hepatopulmonary syndrome. So any evidence of SpO2 in the in sitting position of less than 95%, you need to investigate this patient for hepatopulmonary syndrome. Okay, so pulse oximeter, a simple test. If it's more than that, you can be fairly certain that there's no pulmonary hepatopulmonary syndrome. Okay.
Yes,
in fact, some literature say 97%, but definitely anything 95% and less, you need to examine. If it's more than that, you can be fairly certain that the patient doesn't have hepatopulmonary syndrome.
Coming back to echo, what are the other things you'll get in this patient, in a patient of liver disease? Other manifestations, cardiac manifestations, what all can you find in echo?
In
echocardiogram.
In the patient will have a hyperdynamic circulation. So, but most of the patient will have a preserved ejection fraction. There might be a underlying coronary artery disease which might be masked. So, and we have to see the portal. That is, we have to see the pulmonary artery pressure, which can be indirectly measured by the right ventricular pressure. That is, tricuspid regurgitant jet value can be calculated, provided if there is no pulmonary stenosis. So if it's more than 35, then that means the patient is having. If it is more than 25 in a resting patient and more than 30 in a exercising patient, that means there is pulmonary hypertension. And if it's more than 50, that means it's severe pulmonary hypertension. That validates pulmonary artery catheterization to see for the pulmonary vascular resistance and whether there is any obstruction causing it. So other than that.
And status of fluid responsiveness from the IVC. You just have to do a subcostal view to see the IVC and see for fluid responsiveness. Okay, for fluid deficit. That's it.
What is cirrhotic cardiomyopathy? Yogesh?
Yes, the patient will have a dilated cardiomyopathy due to alcoholism as well as.
cirrhotic cardiomyopathy is a very distinct finding which you have to look for in when you do an echocardiogram in these patients. So what are the findings? You said it's the ejection fraction, the contractility is preserved, but it's a hyperdynamic circulation. So cardiac output is very high in these patients. So typically you may have cardiac output of 10 liters, 12 liters, 15 liters also sometimes, depending upon the severity of the disease. And then cirrhotic cardiomyopathy is a very complex disorder, but basically it is a diastolic dysfunction where because of constant catecholamine release in these patients, incidentally, why is there a hyperdynamic circulation in these patients? What's the cause of hyperdynamic circulation and an increased cardiac output in patients with liver disease?
In cirrhotic patients, there will be an increase in vasodilatory substance such as nitric oxide, prostanoids, and there will be a decrease in vasoconstrictive substance such as endothelin. And there will be an imbalance, so it will lead to a reduction in total peripheral resistance. So there will be a vasodilatation through the blood body, and there will be a hypodynamic hypovolemia in the systemic circulation and hyperolemia in the splanchnic circulation. So basically, it is a increased blood volume will be there, but in the systemic circulation will be hypovolemic and it will be vasodilated. So even with the BP of 180, the patient will be well perfused because of the vasodilatation and an increase in heart rate.
So this it gives rise to reflex catecholamine release, and there's an increase. There's a constant barrage of catecholamines trying to vasoconstrict and trying to maintain the perfusion. So this constant catecholamine release gives rise to this cardiomyopathy, which is typically seen as a diastolic dysfunction in these patients. So the liver is not able to dilate very well, because of this constant catecholamine, because it's trying to contract and hyper contract all the time. So an increase in cardiac output, a diastolic dysfunction is what characterizes cirrhotic cardiomyopathy typically. And you can also diagnose it on ECG by an increase in the QTc interval.
Okay. You finished CBC, LFT, RFT, PT-PDT. So I think blood investigation complete.
Yeah, done. And we've done echo also.
Echo also is done. Any other investigation?
ABG.
Yeah, any other investigation radiologically for liver patient particular?
If the patient is coming for a liver resection, we can go for an ultrasound to see whether the presence of portal hypertension can be seen in ultrasound itself, and presence of dilated varices.
Do they give any pressures or any gradient to say how the patient is? Means the sonographers will give some pressure gradient, right? So to say,
you define portal hypertension.
Portal hypertension is defined by if the hepatic venous pressure gradient is more than 5 millimeters of mercury, then it is defined as portal hypertension. And if it goes more than 8 to 10 millimeters of mercury, there will be esophageal varices, and if it's more than 15, there will be resistant ascites. So,
okay. So ascites, you mentioned about ascites in this patient also. What is the theory for ascites? Means there are two theories, no?
There is forward theory and backward theory. The forward theory is basically the blood flow is dependent upon resistance and flow. The total blood flow of the liver is dependent upon resistance and flow. In the backward theory, the concept is due to cirrhosis, due to the fibrosis of sinusoids, resistance will increase in the portal venous system, and this in turn will cause backward pressure. That backward pressure, in causing increase in resistance, will lead to portal hypertension. In forward theory, since the liver is getting less blood supply, there will be increased blood to the splanchnic circulation. So the flow will be increased. So in this equation, the flow is increased. That's why the pressure is getting increased. So there are two theories. Both theories are not mutually exclusive. Both can be present in the same situation. And
no, actually, if you use a term called overfill and underfill theory, that will be more it's more acceptable nowadays, because if you say it is overfill, it is a back pressure theory. If it is underfill, what you said as nitric oxide leading to vasodilatation, that kicks all the renin-angiotensin system and it reabsorbs sodium and water, ADH system and the sympathetic. Everything leads to accumulation of water and electrolytes. Okay, that is underfill theory. As you said, it's not mutually exclusive. It can be in different percentage in the same patient.
What are the factors affecting hepatic blood flow? Now that you mentioned.
Hepatic blood flow, it has a dual blood flow, the portal vein and hepatic arterial blood flow. There are intrinsic as well as extrinsic factors affecting hepatic blood flow. The intrinsic, one of the most important is hepatic arterial buffer system. And in this, normally whenever there is a decrease in the portal venous pressure, portal venous flow, there will be increase in the vasodilation of the hepatic arterial system, and hepatic artery will compensate for the decrease in the flow. If there is a hepatic arterial vasoconstriction, the portal venous flow will increase and it will compensate for the circulation. It is mainly maintained by adenosine, that is in the periportal regions. Adenosine will be present, which is a vasodilator. So if the portal flow is higher, it will wash out the adenosine and hepatic artery will constrict. If the portal flow is less, the adenosine will get accumulated and hepatic artery will vasodilate and it will compensate for the increase. But this buffer system cannot replace the total flow, because portal vein brings about 75% of the flow and hepatic artery brings about only 25% of the flow. But it can compensate for the oxygen level, because hepatic artery is rich in oxygen than that of portal vein, so it can compensate for the oxygen level. In anesthesia, this is the important factor, and we should not abolish this mechanism to prevent liver injury. And other intrinsic mechanisms are myogenic theory, that is whenever there is increase in pressure, it will cause vasoconstriction, and decrease in systemic pressure, it will cause vasodilatation. And other theories are metabolic, that is post-glycemic, there will be increase in the blood flow. And neurohumoral, glucagon will increase the blood flow, insulin will reduce the blood flow. And vasomediator, that is alpha receptors produce vasoconstriction, and beta receptor will produce vasodilatation. That is vasopressin will cause a selective vasoconstriction to the splanchnic circulation, and vasodilatation in systemic circulation.
Okay.
Any other?
So now can we go to anesthetic considerations?
Yeah, we have already, it's already 45 or 44 minutes. Let's go to a case.
Now this patient is posted for elective surgery for hernioplasty. So laparoscopic hernioplasty. So start telling us principles of anesthesia and how will you prepare the patient, intra-op management and post-op management.
Preoperatively, we should assess the patient hydration status. The patient should be adequately hydrated. There should be judicious use of fluids in this patient, and we should assess the presence of anemia. If there is anemia, we should correct the anemia. And if there is presence of coagulopathy, we can use injection vitamin K subcutaneous or IV 10 mg OD dose for 3 days, and we can use FFP 12 to 15 ml weight. Increase the. If it is still lagging, then we can go for a cryoprecipitate or a factor 7, recombinant factor 7. Then platelet, if the platelet is less than 50,000 or if there is any signs of bleeding, we can go for platelet transfusion. Then if active bleeding, then we can go for Treadley present 0.1 international units per kg intranasal Treadley present can be given. Desmo present can be given to increase platelet function. Then
is there any test you can do to find out whether the patient needs all this treatment or not? Because patient may not need all your FFPs and terlipressin and desmopressin and there's something called balancing of coagulation in liver failure patients. What is that? Yogesh?
Point of care coagulation test.
Yeah. So the liver failure doesn't only reduce the coagulants, procoagulants, it also reduces the anticoagulants because they are also vitamin K dependent. Okay. So your protein C, protein S, antithrombin, so they will also be reduced. So these patients are also prone to they may also be prone to thrombosis. So indiscriminate use of procoagulants should not be done. So what is the prothrombin time at which you will start correcting? What is the platelet count at which you will start correcting? All that can be decided by doing a point of care coagulation if you have. That is, what is that?
Thromboelastogram.
Thromboelastogram. Okay. So if the thromboelastogram, if you have thromboelastogram available, then you should do that, because most of the time you find that the patients may not need any correction, right? But supposing you don't have a thromboelastogram, so what will be the correction that you will do? Up to what level of prothrombin time will you do the correction?
Up to 4 seconds more than that of normal is acceptable. The prothrombin of more than up to 4 seconds more than that of normal is acceptable.
Right. Or INR?
An
INR of 1.4 or less should be acceptable. If only if it's more than that, you will do a correction. Supposing you don't have a thromboelastogram. And of course, platelets, you already said, only if it's less than 50,000. Okay. So you will keep your blood products ready, but not necessarily. And you also said you will correct the hemoglobin. What is the ideal hemoglobin you would like to keep in these patients? How much will you correct it to? Patient's hemoglobin is 8. Would you like to correct it or not? He's for a umbilical hernia repair. Not likely to bleed or anything like that, straightforward umbilical hernia.
Normally, these patients will be prone for anemia due to various reasons. So it is better to keep blood as a safety measure and go ahead with the surgery. Since it's a porous surgery.
Yeah, so it's better not to give too much blood. Okay. So hemoglobin of 8 grams is pretty acceptable, between 7 to 8. You don't need to correct more than that, Okay.
More than 8, it increases the portal pressure and decreases the clotting time. More than 8 gram percent HB. So that
it also predisposes the patients to sepsis and to encephalopathy secondary to that. So definitely it has been found to make the prognosis worse in post-operative patients. So whenever you do any investigation, you have to know very clearly what your correction point should be, right, Yogesh?
And when madams ask you that hemoglobin of 8, don't just believe the hemoglobin alone. There's a single point reference. Examine the patient, how stable the patient is. If there is no tachycardia, if there is no hypotension, no need to jump to give blood. And as she said, the chances of bleeding is also very less, isn't it? It will be half an hour to 45 minutes surgery. So you can avoid blood transfusion.
Yes,
Not only blood transfusion, other products also.
And this is a very elective surgery. Suppose if you find the patient is in the bleeding diastasis or something like that, you can wait for the patient to get stabilized, ask him to come after. No need to transfuse or optimize so urgently unless and until it is an obstructed hernia.
Start vitamin K 3 days prior.
Right.
For 3 days prior to surgery, vitamin K injection should be given.
what will be your, intraoperative? You wanted to tell about intraoperative?
Yes, please, sir. Intraoperative, the goal of anesthesia is maintain adequate liver blood flow, adequate oxygen supply to the liver, and avoid hypotension, which in turn will again reduce the hepatic arterial perfusion pressure, and choose an anesthetic agent which is appropriate for the patient. That is an adequate doses. And if it's a volatile anesthetic, it should not alter the hepatic arterial buffer system. Mainly isoflurane or sevoflurane, and maintenance of the body temperature of the patient, maintenance of coagulation, prevention of factors which will lead to hepatic encephalopathy or worsening of the ascites or hepatorenal syndrome.
Okay.
And
what will be your choice of induction?
IV induction, sir.
Sorry, IV. Okay. Drug?
IV injection agents.
How will you induce this patient?
These patients, due to the presence of tense ascites, this patient has to be considered as a full stomach patient. So rapid sequence induction has to be administered for this patient. And before induction, the pre-medication patient has to be given a prokinetic, and bowel preparation has to be done using a lactulose and antibiotic, non-absorbable antibiotic, and a prokinetic agent, and a proton pump inhibitor has to be given. And no sedative pre-medications needed to be given to these patients because it will worsen the presence of hepatic encephalopathy. And rapid sequence induction, the induction agent.
1 second. Will you consider pre-induction arterial line under local?
The procedure involves major fluid shifts and major hemodynamic alterations. Then we can go for a invasive arterial line pre-operatively itself.
Your patient has ascites. There will be rapid decompensation. There can be hypotension. So there'll be the rate of change of blood pressure will be very fast. So there'll be stat crash of there could be stat crash of BP. So we would want we can consider a pre-induction arterial.
The induction agent of choice will be propofol, 1 to 2 mg per kg body weight, and we can go for rapid sequence induction. We can go for either succinylcholine or acronium, depending upon the availability. And succinylcholine, the duration may not be prolonged in most patients because the level of pseudocholinesterase has to be less than 50% for the duration to be prolonged. So we can use succinylcholine without being the fear of prolongation of the action. And the rapid sequence induction has to be followed properly. The patient has to be informed that he might feel some pressure in the pressure in his throat, and 2 persons has to be there for rapid sequence induction. And the care should be taken that after intubation and after putting the cuff and checking bilateral air entry, then only the pressure should be released. Until then, the pressure has to be there. And
during this intubation process, okay, you should take care not to injure any airway structures because they may bleed to touch. Okay, so make sure that you do the process very gently. Even a Ryle's tube insertion may lead to profuse bleeding. Okay, because such patients, if they go for laparoscopy, we need to have a Ryle's tube insertion. So do it very carefully and gently. Okay, that thing we have to make sure.
Use rocuronium for rapid sequence induction in this patient?
Normally, rocuronium will not be preferable in a cirrhosis patient because the duration of action will be prolonged. So if we have an availability of Sugammadex, then and if there is a contraindication for succinylcholine, then we can go for rocuronium. But normally in a liver failure patient, the induction, the muscle relaxant of choice would be either atracurium or cisatracurium because these are not depend upon the liver metabolism.
Right. No, for rapid sequence induction. I was saying that instead of succinylcholine, can you use rocuronium? But in this particular surgery, probably not, because it's a very short surgery. You know, it will not take. So your rocuronium dose, first of all, you will have to use a very high dose.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So in this particular case, you may not use. But say supposing a patient is coming for a liver resection or something, which is a very prolonged case, there you may use rocuronium instead of succinylcholine for rapid sequence induction. Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
Yogesh,
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
is my voice clear?
Yes, ma'am. It's
Yes, ma'am. Now it's
audible.
clear.
So, okay.
What
yeah.
about opioids?
Mm.
Analgesics, what are the analgesics you will give for intraop use?
Before propofol, would you like to give some narcotic? You know, to decrease the dose of propofol, because you don't want, you yourself said you don't want any hypotension. Already the patient's BP is on the lower side, although they do tolerate lower blood pressures quite well, but still you don't want it crashing. So some narcotic before propofol. Yes.
We can give fentanyl on a lower dose compared to that of normal patient.
Right.
Even in the liver, the excretion is the kidney. So normal kidney, and there is a we can go for fentanyl in lower doses, and
You can use narcotics, but you have to be aware that narcotics can create problems. So be judicious with your doses.
The dose can reduce by as much as 50% in them. Yeah.
Okay. So
Of
now,
fentanyl of 1 mic per kilo, 1 to 1.5 microgram per kg can be safely administered.
Yes, ma'am.
so now she asked about analgesic. What will be your plan for analgesia?
Since this is a laparoscopic surgery, we can go for a pre-operative TAP block, and intraoperatively we can give fentanyl as an analgesic during the intraoperative period. In the post-operative period, we can use lower doses of tramadol, and if the patient's liver function permits, we can use a half dose of paracetamol. And they say up to 3.3 grams can be given in up to 3 grams can be given. 3 grams of paracetamol can be given, but we can reduce the dose to half, and we can give paracetamol accordingly.
Okay.
So local anesthetic block, either a TAP block or even port block.
Injection.
But this patient will probably require bilateral TAP blocks, because you have to because the mesh and tacking and everything will also be painful, right? And you can tell me what else will you use for maintenance? What will be your maintenance like?
We can use either isoflurane or sevoflurane, both of which does not alter the hepatic blood flow, and sevoflurane has a safety net than that of isoflurane, but both are equally efficacious. But we cannot use halothane, and nitrous oxide we can use since a short and it can be used for a short duration of period.
What about desflurane?
Desflurane also can be used.
It has a very good safety profile.
So about the fluids, Yogesh, this is a very short duration surgery. How do you want to manage the fluid in this patient?
We can ask the patient to take clear liquids until 6 hours. We can, even up to 2 hours, the patient can take clear liquids, so that there is adequate hydration. And intraoperatively, since this is not a
Your patient is having ascites, isn't it? So as soon as the surgeon enters through the trocar, he's going to see a lake. Now he's going to suck the lake completely. Around 2 to 3 liters of fluid may be sucked, isn't it? For visibility. So what will be your choice now?
We can give a balance salt solution. Will be the choice of fluids. More amount of normal will lead to worsening of the hepatorenal syndrome. So we don't want it to happen. So balance salt solution can, as like ringer lactate or plasmolate A can be chosen. And
Ringer lactate?
Did you say about normal saline? I couldn't hear it.
normal, I prefer ringer lactate or plasmolate A over normal saline.
Why do you not prefer normal saline?
If the patient has hepatorenal syndrome, then more amount of chloride or giving will lead to further worsening of the hepatorenal syndrome. So
It will not lead to worsening of hepatorenal syndrome, but yes, hyperchloremia can further can cause renal insufficiency and decrease your renal blood flow because of hyperchloremia. But so for that reason, you may not want to use normal saline. But would you like to use ringer lactate?
Because lactate might get accumulated in severely compromised liver disease.
What about dextrose containing fluids?
Yes, ma'am. These patients are prone for hypoglycemia, so we have to give a load of dextrose for these patients.
So
Your patient is diabetic.
patient is a diabetic also, so you have to keep that in mind. So invariably in a patient with liver disease, you will have two IVs running. One will have a maintenance dose of dextrose given as maybe half normal 0.45% saline with dextrose, and the other one will have your replacement fluid going. So for replacement fluid, you said you will use a balanced salt solution, or you will you don't want to use ringer lactate because what did you say?
Could cause lactate.
It will just interfere with you. See, in a short surgery like this, it will probably not matter so much. But yes, if it's a very prolonged surgery, maybe a patient going for a liver resection or something, then because you're going to use lactate as it's going to be your monitor for these patients for perfusion, for liver perfusion, for liver function, so many things. So therefore, you don't want anything else interfering with your lactate levels. Avoid ringer lactate in these patients, right, Yogesh? So you will use balanced salt solution. And if you don't have balanced salt solution available, what will you use?
For this short duration of surgery, we can go for normal saline.
You can use normal saline, and if you don't want to use too much of normal saline, you can even use half normal saline, right? Or you can make it isonatremic by adding some soda bicarb to it. Okay, that's one way of adding sodium without adding chloride. Right?
Yes, ma'am.
Understood?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So, but yeah, like Surendra said, he's going to drain about what 5-6 liters of not just 2 liters. It will be about 4-5 liters of ascites. So how will you replace that? What will you replace that with?
Albumin? Any role of albumin?
Yes, sir. We can use colloids for replacement. We can go for albumin or.
What colloids would you like? Can you use?
We can use Gelofuscin or hydroxyethyl starch.
You can use that, but better to use albumin if it's available and if the patient can afford it. If cost is not too much of a problem, then you would like to use albumin. So how much albumin? Anything you use, you must know how much and in what concentration to get.
Normal daily requirement of albumin is around 12.5 grams. So if we give a 5% albumin, which will approximately come to the daily requirement of albumin for 1 day. So we can use a 5% albumin for 1 dose.
Or you can run a 20% albumin during the surgery. You know,
That's a maintenance.
a 100 ml albumin 20%, you can give it over
2 to 3 hours.
during the procedure, or you can replace with half replace with 5% albumin, the amount that you are aspirating with, because the ascites is not going to be, you know, like plasma, so you don't really have to replace it with 5% albumin. Even replace it with 2% albumin, diluted, so that you can give more volume to it, to the patient. So yes, albumin and balanced salt solution and dextrose and you have to monitor the sugars. So if the blood sugars are high, what will you do? Will you give glucose or will you not give glucose to this patient? Blood sugar is 200, 210, 200. Achha, 200.
Blood sugar is so there is no need for blood. We don't need to give
Actually, you know, give insulin along with it. So cover it with insulin, but give dextrose. You know, the liver needs glucose, and it needs insulin to get the glucose, right? So liver patients with liver insufficiency always supply the glucose, and if necessary, add insulin to it. Diabetic or non-diabetic. Diabetic, all the more reason, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
We have given a lot of fluid. Okay, we are giving albumin, we are giving replacement maintenance fluid, and we are giving dextrose containing solutions. Now, how will you monitor the fluids? What are the indicators? How will you monitor the fluids in order to prevent overload?
We can, since we have an invasive arterial line, we can see the stroke volume variation,
Pulse pressure variation.
blood pressure variation, and if it's more than 10, then the patient is still volume responsive. Then we can give some more fluids. If it's less than 10, we have to restrict the fluid therapy. Then we have to make sure the patient produces at least 1 ml per kg per hour of urine output. We can take an ABG and see whether there is any increase in
Lactate. Okay.
Something else also, ABG. I mean, if you'll
Yes.
something else will also give you an indication. You know, when
Yes.
you're removing so much of ascites, so patients tend to become hemoconcentrated. You know, when there is a lot of, it's like a dehydration, because as you remove the ascites will keep forming. You know, in fact, more of it will form once you remove the ascites, because the pressure is less now, so there's no tamponade effect. So the patients tend to become hemoconcentrated. So if there's any increase in hemoglobin level, which you can get from your blood gas if you have, or you can get a hemoglobin level, so or hematocrit. So any hemoconcentration means that the patient may be fluid deficit, may have a fluid deficit. So you can, that also is a good way of knowing whether the patient needs more fluid.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And
see CVPs if you have a line, if you have taken a central line.
Yes, ma'am.
Anything else?
would you be needing a central line for this particular surgery?
No.
Probably not.
No, we already have an arterial line that's sufficient, and we have 2 IVs. That's patient will require volume because of the loss of ascites, not because of the loss of blood, but will definitely require volume because of loss of ascites, and that you need to give along with it.
So if there's any intraoperative hypotension, how will you treat it? Besides fluid.
We can go for vasopressors. After giving adequate fluids, so we can go for vasopressors to increase the blood
What
pressure.
vasopressors?
We can go for noradrenaline, which should be increasing the splanchnic as well as renal perfusion. So, titrate it according to the response.
Usually it will be transient during surgery only because of your inhalational agents, because of fluid loss, because of propofol that you have used, etc. And you, once the surgery gets over, you should come back to his preoperative status. Otherwise, you will. So you will use a vasoconstrictor in these patients. Okay, not ephedrine. Okay, because they are already
Simple.
hyperdynamic circulation. Okay, it needs vasoconstriction. Patient needs vasoconstriction. So if the blood pressure is not responding to noradrenaline, they usually are not very responsive. So what else can you add in these patients typically? So terlipressin or vasopressin is another thing which they respond very well to, especially if the urine output is low and blood pressure is low. So that causes splanchnic vasoconstriction, improves the renal perfusion a little bit, pushes the blood towards the kidney from the splanchnic bed, and you will have a better hemodynamics. So you may need to add vasopressin baseline, small dose, or terlipressin, one of them, along with albumin replacement. Okay. So post-operatively, this patient, what are the main things that you will need to watch out for in this patient? Because intraoperative, everything is under your control. So can you afford to send this patient back to the ward?
So the patient has to be kept in observation for at least 24 hours. During this period, the patient has to produce at least 1 ml per kg urine output per hour. Then we should watch for signs of post-operative acute liver failure in the post-operative period. Then the patient has to be monitored with a multi-parameter monitor. There's a SpO2, NABP, and the patient temperature and coagulability. Patient temperature should be maintained. The adequate reversal has to be confirmed.
Why is temperature important?
Coagulation abnormalities
Can get worse.
Mainly we have to look for any decomposition by sending a LFT. You can monitor LFT post-operatively. Okay, you have pre-operative value, you have post-operative value to compare. Okay, that you can monitor LFTs.
What will be the indicator that things are not going right? What are the indicators? Besides your clinical things, like you said, a decrease in urine output, blood pressure not being so stable. What are the lab parameters? If everything is okay, any lab parameters, like he said, LFT, you will need to see. But what particularly would you be looking at? Any particular test?
Post-operative period.
Post-operative period, yes. So renal function, so kidney function. A reduction in urea compared to pre-op is an indication of liver not functioning too well, because you need the liver to convert ammonia to urea.
Yes, ma'am.
For urea synthesis. So a decrease in urea may be an indication, may not be a good sign in these patients. So also creatinine to see for how the kidneys are functioning, and bilirubin and your enzymes, liver enzymes.
Yes, ma'am.
Not so much in this particular case, so much because it's you have not really gone close to the liver, and you've not really caused much problems to the, except for like insult because of your hypotension and hypovolemia. But say if it's a case of liver resection or something else, like a shunt or something, tips for in a bleeding patient, there this becomes very critical. These your liver functions become very critical here,
Yes, ma'am.
to know how they are progressing and how the patient is behaving. So INR will be another one. No?
Now, if this patient comes for endoscopic management of bleeding varices, then what will you do? Quickly tell all the points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just bleeding varices.
So initially the patient, the crystallites has to be given to replace lost blood volume, and 2 large bore cannulas has to be secured for blood transfusion, and massive blood transfusion protocol has to be activated, and blood bank has to be contacted about the possibility of massive blood transfusion. Then the variceal ligation has to be done. Before this, the patient, due to the bleeding, the patient has to be given bowel care, and pantoprazole infusion has to be given, and the induction has to be again with rapid sequence induction. And so post intubation, the patient might go in for hypotension, which has to be corrected with either volume replacement.
In the endoscopy lab,
Ma'am?
this procedure, where will you do it? So variceal ligation is generally done in the endoscopy
Endoscopy
lab. So should you do it there,
Or should you get them to OT?
or should you get them to OT? A
It is
bleeding patient, massive bleeding.
If a gastroenterologist doesn't accept, give him a coffee and bring him to the theater.
Yeah, try and convince them. They're not very happy coming to the theater. But these are very tricky patients, So, and in the gastroenterology lab, you may not get a proper table, which may be tiltable. These are absolutely, absolutely full stomach patient. You can't get anybody more full stomach than these patients. So,
The help
it might be
inadequate.
Pardon?
The help is also inadequate.
Help is inadequate. You are away from the main theater area where you may have help is more easily available. So when you do this, when you are asked, say that you will do it in a situation which is either you have an proper anesthesia machine and a good tilting table and everything available, and a difficult intubation cart. You can't be having blood in the mouth and not being able to see. So maybe in the operation theater. Okay, go ahead. So you said rapid sequence induction, and you will have to secure the airway. Can you do it like non-bleeding variceal ligation? You don't need to intubate those patients. No, we do variceal ligation in the gastroenterology lab, but we don't intubate those patients. We just do it with
Propofol, fentanyl. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
But this particular patient will probably need will definitely should be intubated, and the airway should to be secured, so that, because it may not be very easy as a procedure, because there's so much blood there, they may not be able to see, so they need to suck and wash and do all sorts of things. So
Yes, ma'am.
what else?
You
something like
injection, you can run
Yes, ma'am. Octreotide or somatostatin analog can be given to reduce the
should
Should be given. No?
reduces the
has to.
Yes.
So it reduces the splanchnic blood flow and reduces the bleeding tendency. And,
What else can you give besides octreotide? Even terlipressin,
Terlipressin.
cause a reduction in bleeding. Any idea what is the dose of terlipressin?
0.1 international units per kg body weight.
Yeah, around 1 milligram stat you can give IV slowly, but you can give 1 milligram in the emergency itself. In the while you do other things can be. Okay.
So the post-operative period, patient might go in for hepatic encephalopathy. So care must be taken. The patient has to be shifted to ICU, and patient again has to be given lactulose, rifaximin, to reduce the ammonia load.
You can keep them intubated at least for few hours, and you can delay your extubation. Okay, no need to hurriedly extubate this patient.
Yeah. Better to wait and make sure that there is no more bleeding before you extubate.
Sometimes they may go for relook after 4 hours or 6 hours if there's a rebleed.
Rebleed.
So keep them intubated and arrange blood products. Look for blood grouping, typing. Okay, simultaneously make sure.
Yes, sir.
So suppose you have.
Here we'll give the FFPs which you were talking about, no? And here you'll ask for massive cross-match 6 PRBCs, 6 FFPs, and any other cryoprecipitate if needed.
Yes, ma'am.
And you'll, along with the IV lines, you'll send a sample also.
Yes.
CBC, KFT, electrolyte. Okay. Yeah.
And coagulation.
Coagulation.
And a quick word on liver resection. No? If the same patient comes for a liver resection.
Do we have time for that? Or can we carry on?
Already 1 or 10 minutes. Okay. I think
1 hour 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Yeah.
9:20.
Maybe low. So quick points on liver resection is only low CVP.
So, what are the problems, Yogesh? And let's just briefly do it. So, what are the problems that you anticipate in a patient who's coming for liver resection?
Basically, massive bleeding and so the liver resection we can divide into preoperative and intraoperative, postoperative. So preoperatively, the patient, the strategy for liver resection has to be discussed with the surgeon. That is, we can do a portal venous embolization if it's a right lobe. Then the patient has to be judiciously hydrated in the preoperative period. And intraoperative, during resection, we should maintain low CVP. And during manipulation of the liver, we make.
I said my question was very specific. What are the problems you anticipate? I'm not asking you the management. I know we've already discussed all that. So, what are the problems that you will anticipate in these?
Massive bleeding.
Number 1, bleeding. Okay.
Bleeding. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Coagulability, coagulation disorders.
Right. What else?
And reperfusion injury can occur during Pringles maneuver. The total duration of the Pringles can be up to 90 minutes, and reperfusion injury can occur, which can go for worsening of the renal function. Because of the low CVP, we can go for acute renal injury.
What else?
And severe metabolic acidosis due to the low perfusion, which has to be corrected in the post-perfusion period. And
so deterioration of liver function, definitely, because you're also going to cut off a part of the liver. So depending on the condition of the liver before resection, post-operatively and intraoperatively, you may have problems because of liver insufficiency, which may manifest in the form of acidosis, intraoperatively also, and of course post-operatively, lactic acidosis and metabolic acidosis per se. And what else? Hypothermia.
Yes, ma'am. Hypothermia. We need to correct hypothermia. We need to maintain the temperature in these patients very appropriately. And
right. So you basically you manage a patient preoperatively. How will you prepare?
For liver
for bleeding, how will you manage the excessive bleeding? Some prophylactic measures and some, of course.
We can ask the surgeon to produce the vascular clamping mechanisms. If there is excessive bleeding, we can
Pringle maneuver or something. Okay.
Then
You said low CVP, maintain a low CVP.
low CVP, and we need to maintain the pressures with vasopressors. Even if there is hypotension, we can allow some hypotension during bleeding to reduce the amount of blood loss. We need to be careful if there is any veins which are open, which lead to vascular venous air embolism.
Very good.
We can do a Trendelenburg position to reduce the bleeding during open veins, and
Unless, I mean, that is when there is a large vein which is open. But usually it will be like, because there are so many of these collaterals, it's a venous bleed. And it's a venous bleed which is at a high pressure because of the portal hypertension. So therefore the venous bleed is also quite high, right? So you will try and maintain a low CVP. And how do you maintain a low CVP? By not overloading the patient. What else? Avoid giving PEEP, at least during the initial period. But this is a prolonged surgery. You should give PEEP, and these patients are prone to post-operative pulmonary problems. So positive and expiratory pressure, small amount is useful in these patients. Then tranexamic acid is one thing which you can use in prophylactically, which we routinely use. And if there is excessive bleeding, you can repeat it also.
Yes,
Then correction based on your thromboelastogram or your whatever your investigations. Right. So, and how will you prepare the patient for massive blood loss? What all will you prepare?
We need to have a large bore cannula, IV cannula. Then, if necessitates, we can go for a 9 French triple lumen catheter. There is 2 triple lumen catheters in a internal jugular vein can be inserted, and we need to have a high pressure infuser system. Fluid infuser system. Then we can also have a cell salvage system if there is a need for transfusion. Then,
but if it's a case of malignancy, then we like not to use the cell saver. Because most of the time the liver resection will be for a hepatocellular carcinoma, so you will avoid that. So large bore IV lines, peripheral lines, they are available. And rather than putting 2 triple lumens in your in the internal jugular, you can put a sheath also, a 9 French sheath, because the lumens of the triple lumen or quadruple lumen catheters are narrow. So 1 sheath and maybe is better than using a triple lumen catheter. Along with that, you can put a triple lumen catheter also.
yes, ma'am.
Right, and of course your pressure devices for giving massive transfusion. Okay. And so how will you prevent post-operative liver failure in these patients?
These patients has to be in an ICU for 24 to 48 hours.
What are the causes that these patients for post-operative liver failure is quite high? The incidence in these patients may be quite high, especially if it's in the background of cirrhosis. Like hepatocellular carcinoma will usually occur in cirrhotic patients. So they've already cirrhosis is there. Then on top of that, you are just removing a part of the liver. So an idea about the remnant is very important for you to know. How much of liver are they going? They would have already done their calculations and everything before they go in for resection, because that's as important to them. So must have an idea how much is the remnant going to be. A communication with the surgeon about that liver remnant.
Yes,
Then prevent any ischemia. So which will cause further increase in the further deterioration of liver function. So ischemia will be because of hypotension.
So hypoxia.
You have to maintain your blood pressure all along. Already they are handling the liver, so hepatic blood flow is going to be reduced. So try and maintain an adequate blood pressure if required by means of vasopressors. So don't hesitate to use it. Use vasopressors in these patients. So you were talking about a reperfusion injury, you mentioned. So how do you prevent that or treat that reperfusion injury?
They can have a trial period of 10 to 15 minutes of clamping and then release for a 5 minutes of perfusion. So this will increase the warm ischemia time, and we can give a dose of N-acetylcysteine to prevent the liver from to give the sulfide for the oxidative damage. Then before the reperfusion, we can give a load of soda bicarb infusion. The arrhythmias and hypotension are associated with reperfusion.
Not necessary to give prophylactically. So you correct it. If there is acidosis, you correct it. But yes, N-acetylcysteine is what I'm looking for. Okay. So run an infusion of N-acetylcysteine along with if they are going in for Pringles maneuver, then you should start an infusion along with it.
Yes.
So post-operative problems
Post-operative.
discussed already, but anything else? The liver resection patient who is coming for liver resection will not be having massive ascites and all that, because such a patient will not be fit for a liver resection. You see, so he has to have a significant, not be having, he be having heart disease. Otherwise, you will not be going for liver resection, right? You agree? So the patients may be fairly okay, relatively fit when they come for surgery, but post-surgery patients can decompensate very fast. So that is something that you have to keep in mind, and you have to explain to the relatives about post-operative ventilation, because patient may be absolutely otherwise fit, may not be not that ill. Yes, there is a, it may be it has to be a child A kind of status for a liver resection. And in child B, if it is child B, then it can be a very small resection. It can't be a major resection, as the patients will definitely go into liver failure. So one problem that is in the post-op ascites, because the portal pressures will increase when you have tied off one portal vein because of the resection. So they will have ascites. So for first 48 hours especially, there will be a lot of drain, and these patients can get hypovolemic very fast. So therefore you need to keep a track of their fluid status. So ideally say every 4-hourly or 6-hourly drain replacement, depending on what type of drain it is. If it is pure ascitic drain, then you replace it with albumin or with FFP if the patient is coagulopathic, or mainly with albumin. Otherwise, yeah, that's what we do, replace the drains with 5% albumin. Okay.
Yes.
And
role of epidural, can we place an epidural? Is it possible? What do you think?
Yes, Yogesh, what is the post-operative pain? Will you manage pain in these patients?
The role of epidural and epidural catheterization has to be very carefully considered because of coagulopathy so per se these patients will not be pre-operative, they will be fit, but post-operative they might go in for a coagulopathic state, and so we have to be very careful about epidural anesthesia. So we can go for an IV anesthesia, IV analgesic like fentanyl with a patient control analgesia with a lock-in period, which will be better for these patients. And
Can you, would you like to use epidural? Can you use epidural for these patients? Is it an absolute contraindication?
It is not an absolute contraindication, but it's better to avoid because these during an epidural anesthesia, there might be a hypotension which could compromise the liver blood flow further. So it is better to avoid epidural analgesia.
But you could use narcotic-based epidural analgesia. May not use local anesthetic, so that will not cause too much. Can you use narcotic-based anesthesia epidural?
If you're going to only use narcotic, then we can go for it.
Can you use subarachnoid morphine in these patients? Single shot spinal pre-op, 24 hours, patient is absolutely pain-free.
We have to consider the effect of hypotension during this single shot spinal.
Only morphine, no local anesthetic.
I'm talking about spinal morphine. So what are the choices you have basically, like I'm just throwing these things at you. What are the choices that you have for analgesia? Of course, you have IV analgesia. You can use intraoperative fentanyl infusion, which you can continue post-operatively, titrate it according to the patient response. So you have IV is definitely there. Then number 2 is subarachnoid morphine,
Yes.
very popular these days for abdominal surgery. Okay. So
Yes.
subarachnoid morphine single dose, because it's the first post-operative date, which is more critical. Thereafter, you can manage with PCA also, because all the major problems have been sorted out by then. So subarachnoid morphine is the other option, because patient will not be coagulopathic in the beginning. Hopefully not.
Yes,
The patient is coming for a liver resection. So you can give a single shot and there's no problem of removal of epidural. Number 3 is your epidural. So there are a lot of people who are very much in favor of epidural analgesia because it avoids the problems of narcotics. So what are the problems with narcotics?
Post-operative vomiting. In this patient, mainly
About encephalopathy, like patients and patients' response to, because you've done a significant liver resection. So
Hello.
Yeah, hello.
sorry. Somebody is trying to call me all the time. I should have used the laptop for the Zoom. What was I saying?
epidural.
Advantages of epidural over narcotics.
Narcotics.
Yeah. So you can, so narcotics, the problem is that you may, it may interfere with your assessment for encephalopathy in the post-operative period, whether you use IV or neuroaxial, both. So therefore, you may not like to, epidural or subarachnoid morphine may also interfere with your assessment of neurological status. But a low dose epidural, a lot of people are using 0.0625, very low concentration of bupivacaine people are using. The only problem is removal. So when do you remove the epidural catheter?
Usually on the day 3 of the post-operative period.
So when do you
Okay, ma'am. Okay. Yeah.
hello?
Yes, ma'am. We could hear you.
Sorry. My cousin trying to call me again and again.
Removal,
Was
epidural removal, ma'am. On
Yeah,
third
so
day.
epidural removal, Yogesh, when will you do that? You said after on the third day. Third day? Fourth day?
Yes.
Third day.
Third day.
Uh,
Third day.
that will be the time when the prothrombin time will be at its peak.
We can.
It's there.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Yeah, we could hear. Ma'am, is there anything important? Then you can take the call, ma'am. No problem.
Yeah, sorry.
Because
Yeah, the prothrombin time will start rising in the post-operative period, and on the fourth day, it will be actually the worst. It will be maximum. It's only when the liver starts regenerating thereafter that the prothrombin time will be coming back to normal. So ideally, remove it after 4 days when the prothrombin time has started coming to normal, or else give FFP,
cover.
correct the INR, and then remove the epidural catheter. So yeah, there are no clear solutions. So when you're answering in an exam, if you want to talk about IV, if you're not feeling very comfortable talking about epidural or subarachnoid morphine, IV is also fine because you're monitoring the patients in the ICU. So you can definitely use an IV infusion and titrate as per requirement.
Yes, ma'am.
But yes, it has its disadvantages. What are the disadvantages of IV narcotics?
As you said, we cannot assess the grade of hepatic
Encephalopathy.
then it was sphincter of body contraction, there will be vomiting, there will be sedation, and due to prolonged infusion and compromised liver function, there could be accumulation and prolonged duration of the effect of narcotics. That should also be considered. Then
Right. So,
depression.
But you can, subarachnoid morphine is a good option in these patients. So, small dose. So, and it's become quite popular. So you can actually, if you're prepared, if you have read about it, you can definitely talk about it in the exam. And then comes the monitoring. Monitoring in the post-operative period. So you basically have to monitor for what all do you have to monitor?
We have to monitor the prothrombin time. We have to monitor the liver function test in the postoperative period. Then prothrombin time would be ideal for the functional capacity of the liver. Then
immediately on the first day, you're not expecting the prothrombin time to get corrected. It will definitely be worse. So the three things that you have to really look for in the post-operative period. I told you before, urea levels. If the urea levels are going down, it's a bad sign. Look at creatinine. If it's going up, it's a bad sign. I mean, not a bad sign. It means that your kidney needs looking into. Your liver enzymes. Liver enzymes, you need to monitor the liver enzymes. So initially, of course, they will go up, but then they should start settling down after 48 hours. If they continue to rise, that means there is significant liver injury. Then blood sugar, very, very important parameter to monitor in the post-operative period. Okay. Yes. So as the liver function, if the liver function is not good, if the liver is failing, then your blood sugars will be, patients can go into hypoglycemia. That can be of one first indicator that things are not right. And so monitoring of frequent blood sugars, 2-hourly or 4-hourly blood sugar monitoring, very important in these patients. Okay. So what else is there?
Okay, I think
Then lactate levels. Thak gaya. Yogesh, tired?
It's a long viva.
complete refer.
Lactate levels and ammonia levels. Okay. So these are the things that you will. These are the labs that you will monitor the patient mainly on the first 48 hours. Thereafter, you'll start looking at other things, like your prothrombin time, whether it has started correcting or not, albumin levels, if they're okay or not. Initially, all that thing will be haywire, so no point even looking at it. Okay.
Okay.
So that's it.
Thank you, ma'am.
One thing I wanted to add, say if it's for a prolonged surgery and say a liver resection, BIS, in the monitoring you can add a BIS monitor. So that gives you a good idea about how much of narcotic to use in these patients so that you don't over sedate them. So because their requirements may be much less than an average patient, depending on the degree of liver dysfunction. So BIS monitoring, if it's available, is a good monitor to use in these patients that can help you titrate. And it's good for even cases like, we were discussing earlier, the hernia repair. Even there, it can give you a good idea about, you need not give very high doses of your inhalational agents. Their requirements are much less. The MAC is much reduced in these patients. So BIS monitoring is something that I wanted to add. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Any questions? Any doubts you have?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yogesh. First of all, we need to thank you for
Thank you so much, ma'am,
for taking the plunge.
yeah. So,
And thank you, Suren and Sai.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
ma'am. We learnt a lot from you
Oh,
and from Dr. Yogesh.
yeah.
yeah.
The opportunity for
Prepared
it.
well, he's read up everything, so
Yes, ma'am.
he contributed so much.
Very well prepared and
Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. So we conclude the session on the TED Talks, and we'll be going to telecast this tomorrow. That is on 6th of June at 7 p.m.
Tomorrow or day after? Achha,
Tomorrow, Saturday. See you with another case next time with on TED Talks. So we'll have some other PG who will offer himself for examination with another 3 more examiners. Thank you, ma'am. Good night. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank
For starting this.
very well done, Dr. Yogesh.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
very well done.
So much. Bye. Good night.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Good night.